Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here, joined by Melissa Griffith. Melissa, how are you this fine week?
I am doing good. Excited for our guest who you have not introduced yet. So I'm going to turn it back to you.
Awesome. Yeah. So our guest, we're very excited to have Terri Givens, who is the founder of the Center for Higher Education Leadership, Dr. Terri Givens, who has a storied background and quite a few credentials and experiences to share with us. Terri, welcome to Trending in Education.
Thanks so much, Michael and Melissa. It's really great to be here. And I am also a political scientist. Don't forget that.
Yes. And a podcaster.
Yes, absolutely. I'm definitely a woman of many talents.
Yeah, and you're an author of an upcoming book called Radical Empathy, which we definitely want to dig into as part of our conversation today. But I thought maybe just to start off, I'd like to bring guests in and let them tell us their origin story, what got you to where you are now in your career. And for someone with as varied and a really interesting background, I'd love to hear in your own words, what has been your educational pathway and your career pathway that got you to where you are today.
All right. Thanks so much, Michael, and Melissa as well. So I am the youngest of 7 children. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, and my father was in the military. So I'm actually the first person in my family to finish college. I had a couple siblings who actually went to college but didn't finish. And I was always very into school. I was that kid who would leave after school ended in elementary school, that last day of the semester, and I'd be crying on the way home. So, because I hated for school to be ending. So I've always been very into school. I loved reading, and I remember I would spend a ton of time in the library, and being the youngest, my sisters actually taught me to read fairly early. So I think that made a huge difference in my education, is that I learned to read early on. I ended up going to Gonzaga Prep School. My family's actually Catholic. And Gonzaga is a Catholic Jesuit high school in Spokane, Washington. And that really changed my life. I'd gone to public school up through my freshman year of high school. And going to this prep school, I got onto a track of taking honors classes. And my advisors there were really proactive in making me think about going to a really good college. I mean, probably if I had stayed in public school, I would have, not that's anything wrong with it, I would have gone to University of Washington. That's right. Just the path I was on. But because I had these great advisors, and I was also on the track team, so one of my counselors made sure he talked to the track coach at Stanford, which got them looking at me as well. So, and then I had a friend who went to Stanford, and so she really loved it. And I said, okay, I'm going to go to Stanford. Being first generation, I didn't really know much about the process of applying to college. So I only applied to 2 schools, Stanford and University of Oregon.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah. So luckily I got into Stanford, and that was such a life-changing thing for me. And I have to say, I had some of the best mentors who are still my friends to this day. I had a resident assistant in my dorm, and my advising associate, which was a peer advisor. They just really took me under their wing. And then we had a resident fellow who was a professor in the dorm. He and his family took me under their wing, and it just made such a huge difference in having that personal touch. And so I actually did pretty well in school. I ran track my first 2 years and realized I was never going to make it to the Olympics like some of my teammates. So I decided to focus on school instead. Yeah. Actually, I put myself in the same league as Cory Booker, because he quit football at Stanford after a couple of years.
There you go. Yeah.
You gotta know what you have and what you don't have. So I think you made an excellent choice.
Given my trajectory in life, I definitely made a good choice. So, but I really didn't know anything about what it meant to be a professor and all that. And actually, after 4 years at Stanford, I was kind of burnt out because I was working my way through. I didn't have a track scholarship. I had more of a need-based and merit-based scholarship. So I got out and worked for 6 years, and then decided to go back to graduate school and got into UCLA. And again, had some amazing mentors who helped me through that whole process of becoming a professor, and got my first job at University of Washington. So I did end up at University of Washington eventually.
There you go.
And then was there for 3 years, went on to University of Texas at Austin. Career took off, became a center director, vice provost, all kinds of stuff. And I finished my academic career at Menlo College, and decided to leave for a variety of reasons, which we can get into later.
Yeah, and then you founded
the Center for Higher Education Leadership, a year ago.
Right, right.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about the Center for Higher Education Leadership?
Yeah, so the reason I started it, which is what I was alluding to earlier, is when I became a vice provost at UT Austin, I realized I didn't know anything about accreditation, assessment, managing 70 people, all of those things. And it was like drinking from a fire hose. And again, I was able to rely on the people around me to get through all of that. I even had to fire somebody, in my first year. It was just, and I look back now and I'm like, oh my God, I could have messed that up so badly if I had taken any missteps. I was thinking about it for many years, why don't we have an easy way to learn how, to go from being a faculty member to being an administrator? And there were lots of face-to-face programs you could, not lots, a few face-to-face programs you could do through Harvard or through some of these other organizations. I did one through ACE, but it didn't really give me the nitty-gritty of, what does it mean to go through an accreditation process? I mean, those things are so dang complicated. And so I decided I would start this centers to help faculty in particular, but even graduate students don't learn this stuff, right? They don't even learn how to make the transition from grad student to faculty. So we've been reaching out not only to faculty and administrators, but also graduate students and saying, hey, here's some information that you can use to be a better faculty member and to be a better administrator. And it's really critical. Even before COVID, I was saying we're in the middle of a crisis in higher ed. Because we're not innovative enough, we're not changing fast enough, we're not student-centered enough, and we've got a subset of faculty, adjuncts, who are struggling to make ends meet, which is ridiculous. I mean, it just blows my mind that we have, these amazing institutions of higher education that have these, we've gone to this fleet of adjuncts who we don't pay reasonably. And, I was guilty when I was the provost at Menlo College, I was guilty of that myself. So I'm really trying to figure out how through education and helping these people become better leaders, can we change the culture of higher ed? I mean, that's a really big thing to take on. You can tell, the way I'm talking about, I feel incredibly passionate about the fact that we have to make these changes. There's hardly any industry in this country that has not made a shift that is trying to take advantage of innovations.
You're bringing up an interesting point that I want to touch on. You hear in higher education that the cost of higher education is also going up, right? And at the same time, you're saying that we're clearly not paying the faculty what they need. Where's the money going is my first question. And what can we do to change that trajectory? From your perspective, what is it that we can do to address this problem though? Because it is too costly and the return is not very there. And still we're not paying the people who are trying to educate our students.
Well, the first step is to start looking at it from a student-centered perspective, right? And that means that what are students coming to college for? The marketing of higher ed has focused on, oh, look at all these great amenities. And you hear a lot of criticism of the lazy rivers. First places that get cut. I'm hearing this from my friends who are faculty. We're cutting benefits and faculty salaries. Unless I see the administration taking similar cuts, that's a problem. So I'm not a firm believer that there's a ton of bloat in most institutions. Part of the increasing costs is we're overregulated. And that's hard for some people to hear. I don't want to see us move to a situation where we're not regulating for-profit institutions. But frankly, I can tell you at Menlo College, we were overregulated. We had the accreditors coming in and saying, you have to do this, this, and this. Even for our business college accreditor, we had to pay the faculty a certain salary. There's all these things we had to do. And the reality is it tends to stifle innovation because there's all these different things you have to do. So first of all, we need to ease up on the regulation and tell institutions, okay, do what you need to do. And secondly, a lot of the money tends not, like I said, the first place to get cut is salaries because that's the easiest place to cut. So instead of cutting faculty salaries, we need to be looking at other areas where we can make cuts because unfortunately that's where we are, and we were there when I was at University of Texas, in 2008, 2009. And even when I left University of Washington in 2003, we were going through a round of budget cuts. And so the number one thing we can do to improve higher education is to invest in it. And I mean, investing in public institutions, because everybody says, oh, defund the police. Well, guess what? We've been defunding public education for a long time. I mean, you can look at the percentage of what the state is paying into these institutions, and it's a straight downward line. And you're getting me on my high horse here, so I apologize.
Good.
But
I mean,
Taxes. Pay your damn taxes, people.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
if you want an I'm sorry, I'm right here in Silicon Valley, and I'm right next door to Atherton, one of the most expensive places in the country. And if these people pay their taxes, we'd have no problem paying for both K through 12 and higher ed.
Mm-hmm.
But we've seen tax cut after tax cut after tax cut. And, the first place that, because it's one of the biggest budget items, higher ed is one of the places that's going to get cut, and then K through 12.
Yeah.
And so it's extremely frustrating to me as somebody who wants to pay more. I would gladly pay more taxes
Mm-hmm.
in order to make sure that both higher ed and K through 12 are getting the resources they need. And it drives me crazy when people say you can't throw money at the problem.
Right.
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
You can throw lots and lots and lots of money at this problem. So the biggest thing we need to do to reduce the cost is put more taxes into this.
Yeah, that's interesting. And also, I do want to get back to the defund the police and fund. What would you fund in lieu of funding the police as much as they're funded? I think is an interesting topic in light of everything that's been going on in the last few months. Before we get there, I just wanted to make sure folks know that you are also a podcaster, right? So,
I am.
So we like to give other podcasters their shine as well. So what's the name of your podcast?
It's called the Higher Education Leadership Podcast, and we're available on all the different major platforms, Apple and Google Podcasts, et cetera. So just look for Higher Education Leadership Podcast.
Awesome. I think we are going to want to pivot more into radical empathy. How do you train and develop folks to be empathetic and inclusive? I think of diversity and inclusion skills as new economy skills. If you don't have them, you need to learn how to get there, particularly in this day and age. But before we go there, I'd love to get a little bit of your perspective on the importance of teaching, because I think that was another topic that we did discuss a bit when we were prepping. So can you pick up a little more on that?
So teaching is really critical. And having faculty that know how to teach is really critical. I did a column in Inside Higher Ed for years, and this was one of my biggest pet peeves, is that you go through graduate school and you might be a TA for a class, a teaching assistant or something, but it's so funny. I did a little survey on Twitter the other day just to see who knew what instructional design was. And out of 150 responses, 70% didn't know what instructional design is. And these are all faculty, right?
Yeah.
And grad students. And I have to be honest, I didn't know what instructional design was until a few years ago.
Right.
I would write about the fact that you go through graduate school, you don't learn how to teach. I remember my own experience in this. I started at University of Washington. I went through faculty orientation. They said, here's these resources. They gave us a bunch of books on active learning and all that. And I'm like, okay. So I did every workshop I could on how to teach. And I felt like I was thrown into the classroom using somebody else's syllabus because, I hadn't developed my own syllabus yet.
Right.
I mean, almost every major college campus has a school of education, and there's no cross-pollination between them and the graduate students in other programs. And so why couldn't we have a class taught by the School of Education for every grad student on campus who wants to be a teacher to learn about pedagogy and instructional design and all of these things? So this is the other big problem with higher ed, right? When we were talking before about, the costs and everything, we have to decide that higher ed is going to be a place of teaching and learning, first of all.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, there are many, many, many great institutions out there that do this really well. But I can tell you just from my experiences, and especially in what we call the Research One institutions, it's not happening a whole lot. And believe me, I'm a researcher. I still do research. I'm writing a book, I just finished the Radical Empathy, and I'm doing another book that's more of a research-oriented book on the roots of racism. But we have to decide that we're going to put resources and give faculty the time they need to do teaching, because that should be our focus. And that's why when I left UT Austin, I wanted to go to a place like Menlo College that I knew would focus more on teaching, because I firmly believe in it. And it's more student-centered, and there's a lot more we could have done to be even more student-centered. And I'm sure they'll be doing more of that going forward. But it's like this radical concept in higher ed that we're going to focus on teaching and being student-centered, and you'll hear a lot of discussion about student success. And it's all about empowering the faculty to be good teachers.
Yeah, and it's even your point about adjuncts before too. A lot of the teaching gets pushed down to the adjuncts or the teaching assistants, and then a lot of the research is treated as the high status. If you want to be on a tenure track, if you want to be advancing in your academic career, it's more about the research side. And I guess in some ways, maybe that does connect to the pivot to the Center for Higher Education Leadership, because
Yep.
that's very much about teaching things that you wouldn't otherwise be
Learn
taught,
in graduate
right?
school.
Yeah. Can you give us a high-level summary what radical empathy is about? Melissa and I have been leaning into having more awkward conversations about race, so feel free to at least make me feel awkward. I'm offering my own awkwardness to the show.
Well, we'll see how it goes. But
Yeah.
let me start by saying why I focused on radical empathy, and I'll show off my own nerdiness, which is I'm a huge Star Trek fan.
Nice.
And one of my absolute favorite Star Trek episodes is the one about the empath.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this woman they find on an alien planet who not only can feel what other people feel, but she actually takes on physically what other people feel.
Mm-hmm.
So I was always enamored of that, and I just thought it was a great idea. And so I've always kind of been interested in this idea of empathy. So as I've been kind of going through my own journey to understand the way I was raised in Spokane, Washington. My parents wanted us to basically be assimilated into white culture. They thought that was the best way for us to be able to succeed in life. We had a few, Black families we interacted with from the military, but other than that, most of my parents' friends were white. But actually, what's interesting is I look back on it now, and when I was in elementary school, my friends were Japanese, Chinese, Hispanic, and white, as well as Black. And so I had a wide range of friends, but still the impression I was getting from my parents, and I write about this in the book, is that it was better to be part of the white world. So I talk about this concept of an internalized oppression. And so for me, radical empathy means, I have a 6-step process, which we can talk about. But the first step was my willingness to be vulnerable and my willingness to look at my own family history and understand, the reasons for why my parents did the things they did, and understanding the context of my own life before I could then turn around and say, how can I understand the experiences of other people's, unless I start by understanding my own. So to me, radical empathy, it's a 6-step process, because it's not something you can just say, hey, I'm going to flip a switch and all of a sudden I'm going to understand the experiences of other people.
Right.
Now, it's a lot of work. And believe me, I having written a whole book about it, it really, over the last few years, forced me to, go back and talk to my, since I'm the youngest of 7, I've sat and talked with my siblings about where the family lived over the years and what it was like being in the military. I found this amazing picture of my dad when he went through non-commissioned officers school. And, typically, and I had to do a lot of research about this, because when you're living it, it just seems normal. This is just the way things are. But when you start to look back at it and dig into those things, it's like, oh, my dad probably should have gone to NCO school a few years after he got into the military, not when he'd already been in for 12 years, or 15 years. And then you see this picture of him graduating from NCO school, and he's the only, there's like 20, 30 guys. He's the only Black guy, And I was just like, oh my God, and unfortunately he passed away in 2001, but I've never had the chance to talk to him about it. And actually I never saw that picture until after my mom died a few years ago, and we started going through all their paperwork, and I was like, my God, what kind of, so I had to start having empathy for my parents and understanding that, because I had always had this kind of anger that, I grew up in Spokane and didn't know my family that was in Louisiana and in Los Angeles and in Pennsylvania. But now I have much more compassion for my parents and the way they raised us, because I have a better understanding of what they lived through and how that impacted me. And unfortunately, I hate to say it, they were sort of right. Assimilation has helped me throughout life. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean that I can't embrace, that my broader, I've gotten to know my broader family. I've done a ton of work. I'm a family genealogist, so another thing that probably impacted me really deeply was I had a friend who's at University of Alabama who invited me out there to do a talk. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to go to Georgia first and stop at Emory. And I have a niece who's at Emory, and I went out and gave a talk at University of Georgia, and then drove over to Alabama. But I did kind of the civil rights tour, right? Actually, some of this was just like a little shocking. You're on the University of Georgia campus and there's all these Civil War plaques and stuff. And you don't realize, oh my God, there were battles on these campuses. And, it's crazy. And then I saw Martin Luther, his center, and where he was born and raised and all that, and the church. And then you go to Montgomery and Birmingham and just all these amazing sites. But the most impressive thing was going to Montgomery, Alabama, to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Otherwise known as the Lynching Memorial. And I just went there because, you know, my friend was going to take me there. I knew it would be very meaningful, but I found the name of a distant family member there.
Wow.
And it was just like, oh my God, my mother's maiden name is Stelly, and Julian Stelly was one of those pillars there for St. Landry Parish, which is where Opelousas, Louisiana is, which my mom was born and raised. And so then I started doing more digging. But anyway, I mean, so all of this kind of led up to this overwhelming sense of you know, my family's history, my history, and how having empathy for my parents, and especially for myself, was so critical to having that broader perspective, that then I became much more grounded in who I am. Because when you're disconnected from your culture and your family, there's a sense of just being detached from so many different things. And so I had to create that attachment and understand, first of all, why I didn't have that connection, and then develop those connections, and then become more grounded in who I am. So the first step of radical empathy is willingness to be vulnerable, which is for me is incredibly difficult, but I've gotten pretty good at it now. Becoming grounded in who you are. And then the third step is opening yourself to the experience of others. So knowing what I had to go through in order to kind of get to this point of feeling comfortable with myself, I can then turn around and say, okay, we all have to kind of make that journey if we're willing. And, you know, I'm going to open myself to your experiences that I made. And so one of the first things I do when I do a workshop around this is I have some, you know, even if you know people around you. So actually I'm going to do this, and we're going to do a little something with you and Melissa.
Nice.
Right now. So Melissa and Michael, you each have to tell each other something, nothing too crazy, but something that you think the other doesn't know about you.
And we know each other. We know each other pretty well.
We have known each other for a really long time.
Yeah. But that's interesting. Yeah.
Let me think about this. Something that Mike doesn't know about me.
Yes.
I'm actually struggling to think of something.
Something from childhood.
Yeah. I'm thinking, because did you know? Because you knew I was in Grenada during the invasion. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
There you go.
I was. Yeah. There you go. Okay, we've done it. We've made it.
That was harder than expected, but yes, well done. Yeah.
You win the game. No, but see, the idea there is to get you digging a little deeper, right? So even though it was hard for you, Melissa, right, you were able to dig down and find something that he didn't know about you. And it's usually, you know, when you're in a business setting, people don't necessarily, the idea is to get people past kind of those initial, you know, hey, you know, I know you like this and that. It's like, what's something that, you know, and if I was doing this in a workshop, I'd ask you to dig, you know, that actually being in Grenada for the invasion is pretty
the fact that I called it invasion and not the liberation should tell you all that you need to know about it.
Exactly. And so learning those kinds of things about each other, it allows you, it's basically practicing empathy. So that's the step 4, right?
Yeah.
So step 4 is practicing empathy. And that's the kind of thing I encourage people to do. You know, just go up, if somebody you know, or even if it's somebody you don't know very well, just ask them to tell you something that, you know, you might not know that they would like you to know. You know, it doesn't have to be some, you know, soul bearing necessarily, but because I did this in a workshop with a group I was working with, and it was amazing. It was like these people had never talked to each other before. And it was just very eye-opening. And
then just real quick, that does kind of speak to the idea of psychological safety too, right? The more that people feel comfortable, feel like they can be vulnerable around others, is both, it encourages psychological safety. So if you can if you can assume the leadership role of, I'm going to make myself vulnerable first, that is very trust building to begin with. It also requires, to your point, I think you have to forgive yourself for your flaws. You have to understand that nobody's perfect, yourself included. But then I also think, like, as more on the leadership angle, where I know you have a lot of experience teaching that, it's almost an inversion of the traditional understanding of leadership, where I have to put my best self forward and always appear as though I have complete.
Yeah, because one of the things I've learned as a leader myself is, you know, by making myself vulnerable to my team and showing that I understand my own flaws and vulnerabilities, it just, it creates a sense of trust, and we're much more likely to be able to engage in a way that is much more meaningful. And so that's something I've tried to practice throughout my career, even before I started this whole process, is to allow myself to say, and that's one thing, you see all these statements coming out from university presidents and CEOs and all that. And the one thing I've said about this is that if you do not acknowledge your own errors and omissions, then nobody's going to believe your statement. If you can't say, we have made mistakes in the past, I personally have made mistakes in the past. And, and I'm not saying this is true just for, these white CEOs and stuff. Every single one of us have made mistakes in the past. And if we can't own up to that, then you're just not going to have any credibility with, especially, I'm seeing students, pushing back on these statements that institutions are making. And it's like, wait a second. I can tell you from my own personal experience, there have been situations I've been in here where it was not, appropriate, or I've been discriminated against. And if you can't acknowledge that, if you just say, oh, we're wonderful and we're going to be proactive, it's like, no, you have to acknowledge what people have been through.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this every time I've had this conversation, right? Like, if anyone calls you out on your flaws, be genuine about it, and you've made mistakes. That is the only thing you can say as a company. I find when you look at the responses that companies have when someone calls them out, it's always the boiler PR message. We are an inclusive company. No, this person has said they've had a bad experience with you. They are putting it out there. Your only job is to apologize and to do better and to try to do better. And I don't know why that's so hard for so many companies to do, because that's all we can ever ask, I think, as a society, is to learn from our mistakes. Because I can tell you, we're going to keep making them. I'm going to keep making them. I'm looking forward to your book. First of all, I think this book is going to be game changing, just so you know. And I'm very excited.
It's a perfect segue into that whole idea of practicing empathy, right? I mean, as leaders, we have to practice empathy on a regular basis, and then take action. And that's what most people who are responding to these statements are saying. Don't just give me a statement. I want to see actions. My mantra is, all these, especially, I'm right in the middle of Silicon Valley, where there's all these venture capitalists, and we know that Black entrepreneurs only get 1% of VC capital, and Black women are 0.006% of that. So a call out to all VCs and investors. I am a C Corp, Center for Higher Education Leadership. Give me a call. We want your investment. But but that's my point. Is that we need to take action, not just say, oh, I'm going to support Black businesses, and no, show us the money. That's what's got to happen. And then the final step is creating change and building trust. And so by taking action, you recreate change, and by taking action and creating change, you're going to build trust, right? If you can show that you're actually going to take the necessary steps to make people feel included, to make sure that they get the when you come down to it, Ibram Kendi likes to say it's all about policy, which I agree completely, but because the policy changes will lead to the increasing resources. But I also think until we get to that point, changing policy, I'm a political scientist, so I know very well how hard it is to change policy. You can change policies pretty easily within companies, within institutions, but even in higher ed, it's hard to change policies, to be honest. Again, some of it comes back to that over-regulation. But the big issue is, what kind of resources, what kind of money are we going to put into it? Because in this country especially, the bottom line is what kind of money and other resources, our country's treasure, are we going to put into solving these problems? Because that's, the bottom line.
And that also ties to a long history of an unequal allocation of that wealth, right? Which is a long conversation for us to dive into at the appropriate time. So the thing I wanted to understand a little more from you, Terri, is, Melissa and I have talked in the past about talking about race, like some of the things, the two defense mechanisms we talked about the most were denial and avoidance. And as someone who's been leaning into this space and out there as a leader, out there doing workshops and talking to people, trying to get people to elevate their understanding, how do you break through? What are your experiences with, people who are just saying, I just don't want to talk about it, or
I don't see color.
or I'm just, Or just avoiding it entirely. Yeah.
Well, one of the more effective ways of doing this is telling stories, which is why my book really focuses on telling stories. And it's kind of a balance between, telling my story, telling some other stories, but providing data. And so I see it as a 3-step process, really, is you can kind of disarm people by, just telling about yourself. It's like, I'm not going to make you talk about race. I'm just going to talk about my life experiences.
Yeah.
I can tell the story of growing up in Spokane, Black and Catholic in Spokane, Washington.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother book.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because the reason people put up defense mechanisms is because they think you're going to try to make them feel guilty. The reason I wrote the book the way I did is because I was like, I can't go and say, you need to do this. I can't walk into a workshop and say, do this, 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 and this.
Right.
Like, no, this is the work I have had to do. Let me explain to you how I have gotten to this point. And, yes, I'm an African-American woman, but I have bias. The way I like to phrase it is we all grew up in the sea of white supremacy, right? None of us can get out of it. This is the community and the country and the culture we live in. Every way you look at it, it's designed, my sister even, who recently got ill, the doctors just assumed she had COVID. And, they did 3 tests that were negative, but they never looked, they gave her a flu test or anything else. Well, it turns out she had something else called valley fever. And for African Americans, it's something that can be really bad. If for some reason the final, after 6 doctors, she finally got to that point. And to me, that's a sign that these doctors were not looking at the fact that, she was just telling me this morning, 25% of people who get pneumonia in Arizona have valley fever, not COVID. So, there's all these indicators out there. And so unless doctors become aware, and actually I have a whole chapter on the medical industry and how it impacts people of color and Black people in particular, because unless we get doctors to take a step back, and so I tell the stories, right? Of how my parents' lives were impacted and how my life has been impacted, personally by the fact that, and I have a friend who's come up with a tool where doctors just have to be forced, as they're doing an exam, to think about race.
Yeah.
So we don't want to not think about race, because there are things, because of our long history of racism, impact me differently than they might impact you, Michael, or my husband, So it's not that you particularly are racist, it's that we all live in this culture. I mean, can you believe that something like 40% of medical students will say that Black people don't feel pain the same way that white people do, because we have thicker skin. Can you believe that? I mean,
did they graduate? Did they graduate?
They graduate this way.
They shouldn't graduate. They shouldn't graduate.
Yeah.
Wow.
That should be a question on the exam. And
if
you get it wrong, automatic
so
disqualifier.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy because I've been, because I did this whole chapter on racism in medicine and so on. And actually, the whole reason I start off the book by talking about my dad died of a heart attack in 2001, and that's the first time I ever looked at the racial bias or the racial differences in things like heart disease. I mean, basically, just being a Black man is a risk factor for heart disease.
Right. Yeah.
And so that was my first foray into it. But anyway, I mean, I've gone far afield from your question.
No,
Michael,
it's a great answer.
Yeah.
Well, and the related thought is like, in light of COVID, in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and everything that's been going on this year, do you think there's an opening now for us to take advantage of that? That's part of why, like, we've shifted for whatever reason to focus on, we're a trend spotting show, so we're able to talk about this as a trend, which is great. Would have been great if we'd been doing it more in advance of this, but it does feel like there is a moment in time right now that people are recognizing, and there's an opportunity to be opportunistic about that. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. We are living in an important inflection point in history. And I'm not sure, I've read a lot of stuff. We're not going to know exactly why this happened for years. All my friends who are out there doing, political scientists, are going to be doing this research.
Yeah.
But my impression living in the moment is that it's the confluence of these things. It's the fact that people have seen all of, with Trump and, many of his supporters, just so blatantly racist. And then video, social media. A friend of mine was saying, oh, we just need to get off of social media. I'm like, no, social media is the reason why people are suddenly understanding what's happening. We would not have seen that 8 minutes and 46 seconds unless we had social media. So no, I don't want to get off social media. I find it incredibly useful. You just have to avoid the toxic parts of it. And then the third point is that we've all been, not all of us, but most of us have been sheltering in place. And so that means we're much more aware. We're on social media more. We're watching the news. I certainly started to watch the news more because of, I want to keep up with what's the latest and should I wear a mask? Should I not? And obviously you should wear a mask. But it's this interesting confluence of events. And it's almost like the Black Lives Matter movement was sitting there waiting for this.
Yes.
And so once that happened, I walk around my neighborhood now and every other house has a Black Lives Matter sign. And let me tell you, there's not a whole, there's a handful of people in my neighborhood who are Black. But, we had a little march the other day, about 500 people showed up just from, this little neighborhood. It was a children's march. So it's fantastic, but also I hope people understand for those of us that have been following this or been part of this all our lives, it's almost frustrating, right? It's like, it didn't happen with Rodney King. It didn't happen with, all these other, now the posters go up with, say their names and there's the long list. And it's still happening every day, it's traumatizing for us who, have to worry. I have two boys who are 16 and 19, I have to worry about my sons. So it's traumatizing in a sense too. And I think what's happening is now empathy is happening, right? People are understanding our trauma of having to go through all of these different, and it's a public, I hate to say it, but in some ways these are like public executions. It's like, we're seeing people die on camera at the hands of authorities.
Right. Yeah.
So,
and then,
do you think this is going to bring about real change though? Because this is the question I keep asking, right, myself on a daily basis. It seems different, but I'm sure the civil rights seemed different at the time, and other things have seemed different. So where do you see us like a year from now or 2 years from now on this movement?
Well, a lot's going to depend on November, and the most important thing we have to do is vote. So if this momentum carries through November, and we do see a change, then I do think we'll see some significant change going forward.
I will just put a plug out there, though, not just vote for the president, but vote in your local elections and vote in the Senate and in the Congress, because the president is one man, right?
And frankly, it has to go all the way down to the school board. Every single position, actually, and I just recently, I'm starting to get involved more in local politics. Just at kind of the commission level, but still, get active if you can, run for office if you can, and vote every single, learn, make sure you read your ballot before you, vote for the right people.
And I know we're getting close to time. I do really like the idea of tying the defund the police conversation to where do we find the funding for education, because it's more a positive conversation, because I'd actually be concerned if you defund the police and then we don't fund anything else with those dollars. I think that's actually problematic. I'd love to get any thoughts you might have on that. And then we typically ask our guests, what trends are you tracking in the world today? I think we talked about a lot of them, but also if there's anything else you wanted to conclude with. But thanks very much for joining us. Really, really enjoyed the conversation. We'd love to have you back more in the future. But
I would love that too.
Any thoughts on any of this?
Yeah, so first defunding, so that it's happening, like the schools in San Jose and I think Oakland have already agreed that they're going to take the police off their campuses. So basically, the idea is you take that funding, because you don't need police on every call, right? You need social workers, you need people who have counseling skills, there's so many different ways to approach this, and there's lots of proposals out there. So it's not just defund, it's like maybe we should be saying redirect. Redirect the money to because the police are trained to respond to crime, right? And so their mindset is, oh, I have to go to this call. And not every believe me, I know that there are really good policemen out there who don't do that, who are trained better, but in many instances, I mean, we see this in the school to prison pipeline, by adding police in the schools, it's just meant that we're treating students like criminals.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So that's one. So I'll leave that there. Invite me back.
We'll come back and talk about that one. That would be a good one. Yeah.
Because I do want to talk more about the school funding issue in particular. But as far as trends, I think, I already mentioned it, and I'll just emphasize becoming more student-centered is going to be the most important thing we can do in higher ed as a trend. And that incorporates so many different things that are happening around innovation, ed tech, pedagogy, all of that. So being student-centered makes you think about things in a different way. And as a faculty member, as an administrator, and where we put our resources.
Awesome stuff. Really wonderful conversation. If you loved getting some of Terri's thoughts today, you can listen to her podcast. Hopefully we'll get her back on again soon. You can also Google Terri Givens. You get results, people can find out more about Terri. Melissa, thanks as always. Any concluding thoughts, perspectives from you?
This was a good conversation. And Terri, definitely want to keep having the conversation with you about all the topics, because I think we just scratched the surface on so many things.
Yes, we did.
Awesome. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back again soon on Trending in Education.